Thank you very much. I suppose this is our opportunity to have a chat about the process that brought the book into being, and it would be crazy to let the moment go without actually asking you to tell us most simply about your motivations behind the Handbook of the Irish Revival, and also to ask you what your ambition for the volume is.
Well, when we began this project some time ago, our thinking was that both of us have been teaching these texts for many years and have noted and enjoyed the response of a lot of our students to these texts, and we're aware that many of them were kind of scattered and not easily available, and important, not just for their own moment, but also we were struck by how many of our students picked up some of the resonance of these texts for our own moment, and were reading them interestingly in their own moment. So we figured it'd be a good idea to try and get some of them together between covers and let them resonate off each other, to try and collect something of the diversity of opinion and thought and ideas of this extraordinarily rich period, and to put it together in this volume in this way. And Declan, I'm sure you've got more to add to that.
Well, I agree with everything you've said, of course, and it was a very happy collaboration. We didn't have a single fight. I was listening to Anne Dolan and thinking of what George Moore said. A literary revival happened because 5 or 6 people lived in the same town and hated each other cordially. But actually, they were even more interested in the contents of one another's minds. I suppose what really struck me, and it struck you too when we were going over these texts with students, was a much wider population out there should be able to get at them and know about them. And this would be true particularly for other young people who haven't had so much study of history in recent decades and want to reconnect with their past. But it would also be true of people in my generation who knew, poems like I See His Blood Upon the Rose or Yeats' Easter 1916, but would like a bit more context. So I think these were all aims we had. But above all, as the President said, to give some sense of the ideas and themes that shaped our nation. If modern American Republic or modern France, these kind of texts would be all together in an easily available volume. And I see it as a very democratic process, and I want to thank you and Fiach for making it possible, because it's something we've long dreamed of, but tonight it's actually incarnated.
Well, I think one of the things that you notice when you're reading through the handbook, or at least one of the pleasures that you experience in reading it, is seeing really lesser known or perhaps totally unknown names and voices and contributions sitting alongside the greatest hits of the Irish Revival, or sitting alongside the kinds of excerpts we've heard already today from Synge, Joyce and Shaw and so on. So you hear names that you might not have heard before, like Mary Battle or Mary E.L. Butler. And how big a consideration was that for you in your selection? Were you actively looking for things we didn't know yet, or were you happily surprised by finding them?
Well, I think probably a combination of both, Aideen, really. In a sense, I think both of us agreed that we didn't really want to tell the familiar story of the Irish Revival. Many of us know the outline of some of the sort of the high moments in it and the big names. But we both discovered, I think, in the course of this project, some really new and interesting texts. And also, as we say in the introduction, we're aware that in certain versions of this moment or movement, many of the voices have been edited out. So I think it was a really important mission for us to try and include some of the narratives or some of the voices that had been edited out. On top of that, then, we also have the fact that some new sources have become available recently with for example, the Bureau of Military Archives have released in recent years some great accounts, contemporary accounts of first-hand accounts of people who were involved in the moment and who give us really fantastic colour pieces. And we find that when you put these newly discovered pieces side by side with some of the more well-known pieces, that you begin to see them anew in a way. You begin to see new possibilities in some of those texts that we knew very, very well, and even bringing new context. For example, I personally was, just to give you one example, one of the most widely known poems of that period is Yeats' The Lake Isle of Innisfree, that everybody will be very familiar with. But when you read that poem side by side with some of it's in a section on the natural world, dealing with issues to do with the environment and so forth. And when you read it in that context, suddenly a poem of kind of twee revivalism suddenly takes on a new complexion, as we see that Yeats is trying to reimagine the Irish relationship with the natural landscape, particularly after the trauma of the famine in the 19th century and so on. So, so that I think certainly motivated me in some of those choices, and I'm sure Declan has more to say.
Well, the other thing is that so many of the great writers whom we would now see as part of high literature casually assumed a popular audience and wrote in newspapers. I mean, in a way, the entire community was conducting self-education by means of discourse, newspapers, and so on. And it's exciting to catch those moments on the fly. You're very much aware of how at the mercy of each moment people were. And, you know, they weren't thinking of this as a great movement that would be construed in retrospect. They were just living and improvising from day to day. And because we've included, you know, over 200 pieces, it gives you that sense of context. And as PJ said, I think a lot of the texts we thought we knew begin to look strange again, even as we found all these strange ones we didn't know ourselves and brought them to light.
I think we might have one of the first extracts that you've selected by way of illumination of the breadth of material that's in the handbook. Do you want to give us a little bit of it's going to be a piece from Mary Colum.
Yeah,
Do you want
the first piece is a piece from Mary Colum, and she again is one of the great voices and great witnesses of the period. She's one of the first women to receive a university education. She is involved in so much of the activities of the era, and in this extract, she gives us a very vivid picture of how rich the moment was in terms of things happening. A sense that somebody with young and interested in ideas and interested in art and literature and debate and political debate could find a lot going on in their own place, rather than perhaps in previous generations having to go to London or Paris to find a critical mass of activity of that kind. So for me, that's one of the interesting things coming from that passage.
She was also hugely excited by Douglas Hyde's Áran Grá Cúige Connacht, the love songs of Connacht, because so many of them were songs voiced by frustrated women who had been forced maybe to marry someone they didn't want or not to marry at all. And this is in the 1890s, the decade of Hedda Gabler and, you know, the radical new woman of Europe. So there's a sense in which the old Celtic woman and the new women are overlapping in Mary Colum's analysis.
Over to you, Ali.
Mary Colum from Life and the Dream, 1947. The vigorous intellectual life of the city was open to the students who wanted it, and even those who didn't could not have missed taking some of it in through the pores. If we learned about the past of literature in the classrooms, we learned about the present of literature, what literature was outside from the men who were making it. Dublin was a small city. The suburbs stretched out to a distance, but the centre, the old part of the city, was circumscribed and bristled with movements of various kinds: dramatic, artistic, educational. There were movements for the restoration of the Irish language, for reviving native arts and crafts, for preserving ancient ruins, for resurrecting native costume, an array of political movements. Here too were the theatres and the tea rooms and pubs, which corresponded to the cafe life of the continental city. In the centre too were the headquarters of the clubs and societies, some at war with each other, but all exciting and somehow focused towards one end: a renaissance. Between Abbey Street and College Green, a 5 minutes walk, one could meet every person of importance in the life of the city at a certain time in the afternoon. The city was then drama mad, and every actor with an ambition to play any drama, ancient or modern, tried it out in Dublin. If it passed the test of a Dublin audience, it could pass anywhere, it was the fashion to say. And Dublin believed the dictum. Certainly, we saw the most diverse kinds of dramatic entertainment, all the way from Oedipus Rex, played by Martin Harvey and staged by Reinhardt, to Mrs. Patrick Campbell in Hedda Gabler, and Sarah Bernhardt and Mrs. Patrick Campbell in Maeterlinck's Péléas and Mélisande. The Comédie Française, as it always did in its provincial tours, took in the needs of the students, and the French 17th century classical drama was played, including the pieces on our course. The acting of the Comédie Française was strikingly different from that of the English companies, and was supposed to be the type that native Irish players could take for a model. Indeed, it was passed around that the real name of the great French actor, Coquelin, was Coughlin, and that his family had originated in Limerick. But at this period, the Irish were claiming almost everybody of distinction as Celtic or Gaelic, if not Irish. Then, Dr. Douglas Hyde's translations of the Love Songs of Connacht threw us all into the same sort of excitement that Herder's translations of folk poetry or Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry had thrown people into in the 18th century. These anonymous West of Ireland songs were mostly women's love songs, and they were unlike any love poetry we read in other languages. They had a directness of communication, an intensity of emotion, which I think is the special Celtic gift to literature. It was odd that in a country where romantic love was not part of the social organization, where it was even mocked at, where marriages were arranged, and where even a sort of deliberate alliance between families, there should have been love poetry of such a high kind. We read these songs in the original and in the striking translations so often that we knew them by heart. The occasional carelessness of Douglas Hyde's language seemed to be all right in these versions of folk poetry. A stylist could easily find fault with some of the words, but we knew it was grand love poetry. It was the poetry of youth, yearning, and unsophistication. And not only this, but it was the special expression of the women of the race we belonged to. Women who were married to men whom they barely knew, who took it for granted that marriage was a destiny they had to accept. But love was an aspiration of the heart and spirit to be expressed in beautiful words by people who had never handled a book except a prayer book. The love songs of Connacht and the new translations of the old sagas set everybody on fire with a desire to have a national literature and to revive a national life. A spirit that had been long asleep awoke. It was surprising that the English government, which proclaimed Land League meetings and threw the Irish members of Parliament into jail for some little political offence, took no notice, or only favourable notice, of this new ardour for native culture. One would think that even a child of 10 would have realised that all this was bound to develop towards another and more determined fight to throw off the English yoke.
Those two excerpts, because they come from two different parts of the volume, when you put them together, it appears that there's kind of a hop, skip and a jump between Abbey Street and Stephen's Green on the one hand, so a local and a civic sort of moment, and a local and a civic endeavour. And next thing, you're moving towards the love songs of Connacht, and she talks about a national literature. Where, or can you measure or can you assess where the civic and the local end and where a sort of a national endeavour starts to become visible?
Well, I think what we find when we read some of these extracts and some of these writings is that there's so much of all of that going on. I think it is a great civic. The revival to me is a great civic moment insofar as people are gathering together in meeting rooms, in parishes, in villages and towns all over Ireland, in new organisations like the Gaelic League or the GAA or the Cooperative Movement, in a civic space, in a secular space, for the first time perhaps in modern Irish history, outside of the regulation of church or the colonial state. And I think that's certainly there. There's also clearly a national dimension to all of this, although the actual constituents of that nation is contested. Some people think being Irish is being Gaelic, some people think it's being Catholic, some people think it's being Republican, some people think it's being Celtic. So there actually isn't really a huge consensus, I think, at this period as to what actually constitutes a national identity. And as we find out from that extract as well, there's a huge civic thing. I mean, it's a lot of it is located literally between the two canals here. But it's, I think, important also to realise that it's not just a Dublin-centric project, that it's one that is taking place in literally in parishes across the country at this point in time.
It's also amusing to hear about the French actor who's really named Coughlin. It's like the Jack Charlton theory of Irish culture, that Irish when they win, foreign when they lose, And there's a slight element also of assimilating the whole global narrative to Ireland about those moments, which maybe even the first sort of stirrings of the globalised Irish over 100 years ago.
Certainly somebody who thought he was contributing to a national literature is William Butler Yeats. We're not going to hear his poem, but we are going to hear an excerpt which relates to the response to one of his poems from Maud Gonne. Would you like to introduce that excerpt for us so that we understand its context?
Well, sure. So this is, first of all, Maud Gonne's response to Yeats's poem Easter in 1916. It's the one that we all associate with that moment. It's the poem that begins kind of with derision for the rebels, and then morphs as the poem moves through. It's a poem of two movements in many respects, into trying to accommodate and think about the weight of the moment that's just taking place. And he fuses these contradictory feelings he has in this idea that a terrible beauty is born. And what's interesting about the poem is that he tries to speak for the nation, to give us a moment of commemoration, simply naming the fallen leaders of 1916. But he also gives us some personal glosses on the figure. So the MacBride is referred to as that drunken, vainglorious lout, and there's reference to Pearse and MacDonagh and various other people. So that's the context, and the extract we're about to hear is Maud Gonne's response to that poem.
Jane, thank you.
Letter to W.B. Yeats, November 1916. My dear Willie, no, I don't like your poem. It isn't worthy of you, and above all, it isn't worthy of the subject. Though it reflects your present state of mind, perhaps, it isn't quite sincere enough for you who have studied philosophy and know something of history, know quite well that sacrifice has never yet turned a heart to stone, though it has immortalized many, and through it alone mankind can rise to God. You recognize this in the line which was the original inspiration of your poem, "A terrible beauty is born." But you let your present mood mar and confuse it till even some of the verses become unintelligible to many. Even Isolde, reading it, didn't understand your thought till I explained your retribution theory of constant change and becoming in the flux of things. But you could never say that MacDonagh and Pearse and Connolly were sterile, fixed minds. Each served Ireland, which was their share of the world, the part they were in contact with varied faculties and vivid energy. Those three were men of genius with large, comprehensive and speculative and active brains. The others, of whom we know less, were probably less remarkable men, but still I think they must have been men with a stronger grasp on reality, a stronger spiritual life than most of those we meet. As for my husband, he has entered eternity by the great door of sacrifice which Christ opened, and has therefore atoned for all, so that praying for him, I can also ask for his prayers, and a terrible beauty is born. There are beautiful lines in your poem, as there are in all you write, but it is not a great whole, a living thing which our race would treasure and repeat, such as a poet like you might have given to your nation, and which would have avenged our material failure by its spiritual beauty. You will be angry, perhaps, that I write so frankly what I feel, but I am always frank with my friends. And though our ideals are wide apart, we are still friends. I am writing this in the confusion and weariness of a déménagement. Our new apartment is small, but it has a wonderful roof terrace from which one sees the chimney pots of all Paris and gorgeous clouds and sunsets. Money affairs are worrying and may prevent us leaving Paris for another month. I will let you know as soon as dates are settled. I would like to see the Hawkswell, but fear we shall be late for that. However, you will bring it to Ireland, will you not? How nice, really, getting your old castle. I hope you will succeed in that. It sounds very fascinating, and it would be a lovely place to have, and you could put all your treasures and make really beautiful. Always your friend, Maud Gonne.
You have to remember also that Easter 1916, apart from being the great political poem that P.J. described, is a love poem. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. It's autobiography. It's after what my mother used to refer to as Yeats's 2 decades of hopeless foreplay with Maud. And he's writing this poem in a last-ditch attempt to get her to say yes. And well, she knows it, and that's why she knows how to say no. One of the other characters, by the way, in our book, George Sigerson, was one of the first psychoanalysts in Dublin, and he managed to psychoanalyze, apparently, both Maud Gonne and Nora Barnacle, the model for Molly Bloom. So one said yes, but the other said no.
There's something so amazingly fresh about the idea that somebody's responding to what has become an iconic poem only weeks or months after it has been written. And that sense goes throughout the whole book, I think. One of my favourite parts in the whole book is the Keegan excerpt that we're going to hear next. Will you put that in context for us so we can understand its geography or its manners or its...
This is I think, a very lively piece in the Handbook by volunteer Joe Keegan. It's a piece that became available in that material from the Bureau of Military Archives. So it's an eyewitness account of a volunteer just before 1916, and he gives his account of his actions on Easter Sunday. So it was the day where Owen MacNeill published an article in this, or a message in the Sunday Independent to try and call off the rising, the countermanding order. And MacNeill bumps into Joe Keegan after 8 o'clock Mass in Rathfarnham on the Sunday, and gives volunteer Keegan a handwritten message to be delivered to Patrick Pearse so that he's absolutely sure that the what's in the newspaper is absolutely true. It's a great first-hand account, and I think a very good example, really, of people reacting in the moment and giving us a sense. Like when we look back now, sometimes we have a fixed idea and a fixed notion of history that's been given to us through various historical accounts or whatever the case may be. This is really a response to the moment, and it gives us a sense of the confusion of the moment. It gives us a sense of the coincidence, the serendipity of the moment, but also the manners of the moment. It's a wonderfully rich and evocative portrait of the as I say, the confusion and the excitement and the manners of that moment. So, Joe Keegan.
Ali, thank you.
Sean Joe Keegan, The Countermanding Order, 1916. My wife, reading the paper, said, "This is a very dangerous business, I think, and you will need to mind yourself. I hope everything will be all right. Remember, dinner is at 2 o'clock. I set out for the city on a bicycle at 8:55 a.m. 25 minutes later, I was knocking and ringing at the hall door of 27 Mountjoy Square. The door opens and I said, "Good morning, nurse. I called to see Mr. Plunkett." "Oh dear," she replied. "Mr. Plunkett has gone away, bag and baggage, about 1 hour ago. It's really too bad." "No harm done, nurse," I said. Then, "Good morning and thank you." Nurse said, "Good morning." I enter Mr. Whelan's shop. A volunteer in uniform is at the counter conversing with the lady assistant. I said, "Good morning, miss. Is Mr. Whelan in?" She said, "No, Mr. Whelan is out." "Will he be back soon?" I inquired. "No, I don't think so," she replied. I then asked, was Mrs. Whelan in? And she said, "Oh yes, Mrs. Whelan is in, but you can't see her. She is bathing the baby." I then said, "Oh, look here, I don't mind. I've seen babies bathed before." She said, But what?" Mrs. Whelan, in the room off the shop, hears the conversation and comes to the door, baby in arms. Mrs. Whelan said, Well, but you're an early visitor from the hills." I replied, Yes, I'm looking for himself, and your assistant says he is not in." Mrs. Whelan said, "He is upstairs, so go up and see him." Mr. Whelan is on his way down as we meet. Mr. Whelan said, "What's the news? Anything strange? You're early in town." I replied, "Well, as you know from the morning papers, everything is off for the present. Yes, it's too bad." I continued, "Well, I'm in town trying to locate Mr. Pierce or Mr. Plunkett with corroboration of the press notice in Mr. McNeill's own handwriting. I got the address 27 Mountjoy Square and 44 Mountjoy Square, and I have failed to make contact." Mr. Whelan remarked, "Oh, that must be 44 Mountjoy Street. You should try there. Just ask for Sean T, and there you are." "Well, wait, I shall come with you. There are usually G-men knocking around there." Mr. Whelan brings out a bike and sticks a revolver in his pocket, remarking, "You never know." We are going up Capel Street now, and at Dominic Street corner he says, "You go up this way and I'll go round Blessington Street and we'll meet accidentally at 44. That plan worked out, but it brought no result from 44. There was no Sean T there. The G-man was outside all right, and there were a good many lads inside the parlour, if one was to judge by the revelry. Mr. Whelan suggests to go down to Sean T.'s address at Belvedere Avenue, and I part with him, wishing him Godspeed, and I'm on my way again. Very soon after, I arrived in Beresford Place, where there appears to be thousands assembled. I try to cycle through the crowd towards the hall. Several voices shouted, "Pull him off, don't let him in there." "Easy on, friend, I'll get off." "But you can't go in there," shouted my interrupter. "And why not?" I inquired. "What's the objection?" "You're a policeman, a spy," he repeats. "Now, do you think if I were a policeman," I said, "that I was going to rush this place all by myself? Have a little sense," I added, and kept moving forward. "All right then," he said. "Go on, but look out for yourself." I am now on the steps of Liberty Hall. I make up my mind that I cannot ask for Commandant Pierce right away, so I decide to ask for Councillor P.T. Daly. But before doing so, I see Countess Markovitz on the stairs landing, so I decide to approach her, which I do with a military salute, saying, "I have a dispatch here for Commandant Pierce. Where can I see him?" To which she replied, "I know nothing about him." I am in a quandary to know what to do next when a voice rings out from the top stairs, "Hello, Sean." It was a voice that I knew well, for I had known it for close on 25 years. It was Captain Sean Connolly who spoke. I hastened up the stairs towards him and we shook hands, had a few friendly words about old acquaintances, and in answer to my inquiry for Commandant Pierce, he opened the door of the council chamber and I went in, and there, sure enough, was Commandant Pierce coming towards the door. I saluted him and handed him my dispatch. Before he read it, he asked me did I want any answer to it, to which I replied, "I don't think it requires any answer. It is, as far as I know, the commands of the Chief of Staff." He then said, "Tell him it shall be so."
I think that's what they call an iterative process. Amazing that it actually got into the right hands at all, but much more interesting to think about what happened thereafter. I know you've been, we've been discussing, I suppose, the competing modernisms that are part of this time. We've been talking about popular culture, we've been talking about high modernism. The piece we're going to finish on this evening is by Percy French. You might give us a sense of where you see that sitting within the overall thing.
Well, I heard this years and years ago done by Ronnie Drew, and I was listening to it a few months ago when we were editing the handbook. It's called The Queen's After Dinner Speech, and I remembered that just a few years ago there was perhaps an even more famous Queen's After Dinner Speech, which went very successfully, and rightly so, here in Dublin, after which the previous president uttered an exclamation which the current president would never utter, the word wow. This is Percy French's imagining of what a Dublin butler or servant at a table imagined to be the Queen's after-dinner speech when Victoria came. And what I love about it is that it's in the Dublin dialect. We're sitting here on a Sean O'Casey sofa on a stage which is for The Shadow of the Gunman. And this comes years earlier and shows you that the Dublin dialect was already in fine fettle for many, many writers, including the great Percy French, who had a great love of locality and of the kind of private languages that went with it. So it's just his imagining of if Queen Victoria had been a Moore Street exponent of Dublinese, how she might have described the whole event in slightly different terms.
Thank you, Jane. This is our final excerpt of this section. Thank you.
Percy French, The Queen's After Dinner Speech, 1900. "Me loyal subject," says she, "here's me best respect," says she, "and I'm proud this day," says she, "of the elegant ways," says she, "that you gave me the hand," says she, "when I come to the land," says she. "There were some people said," says she, "they were greatly in dread," says she, "I'd be murdered or shot," says she, "as like as not," says she. "But it's mighty clear," says she, "that it's not over here," says she, "I have cause to fear," says she. "It's them Belgium," says she, "that's throwing the bombs," says she, "and frightening the life," says she, "out of the son and the wife," says she. "But in these parts," says she, "they have warm hearts," says she, "and they all like me well," says she, "barring the Honor Parnell," says she. "I don't know, Earl," says she, "what's come over the girl," says she, "and that other one," says she, "that Maud Gonne," says she. "Dressing in black," says she, "to welcome me back," says she. "Now Maud'll write," says she, "that I brought the blight," says she, "or changed the season," says she, "for my own private reasons," says she. "And I think there's a slate," says she, "of Willie Yates," says she. "He should be at home," says she, "French polishing his poems," says she, "instead of writing letters," says she, "about his betters," says she, "and parade me crime," says she, "in the Irish Times," says she. "And I'll give you a toast," says she, "at which you may boast," says she. "Now I've a power of sons," says she, "all sorts of ones," says she, "some quiet as cows," says she, "some always in rows," says she, "and the one that causes the most trouble," says she, "sure the mother loves double," says she. "So here's to the men," says she, "that's gone into win," says she, "that's clearing the way," says she, "to Pretoria today," says she, "and the gap of danger," says she, "there's a Connacht Ranger," says she, "and a Fusilier not far," says she, "from the heart of the war," says she, "and I'll tell you what," says she, "they may talk a lot," says she, and them foreign baboons," says she, "may draw their cartoons," says she, "but there's one thing they'll never draw," says she, "and that's the lion's claw," says she, "but before our flag is full," says she, "we'll own the world," says she.